3, 4. It's Hi, another week passed, another minor goal accomplished. Picks of the week. Ba-da, ba-da, ba-da. So, let's see what we have here from the comic book store. First up, we have American Ronin #1. This is, again, by the very new and prolific AWA studio, which, of course, stands for While Again. I don't know. This is written, so far, like I say, most of the books I've read from this publisher, Year Zero, Old Guard. There's the Northern Noir one, like the Midwestern Noir one, Devil's Highway. They've all been really good, and they've all been marquee talent for the most part. This is written by Peter Milligan, who's been one of my favorite writers since I was in high school. He cut his eye teeth at the Vertigo imprint of DC Comics back in the early 90s. He might not have been as kind of flashy as Grant Morrison or Alan Moore, or as profane as Garth Ennis, but he's really, really good. He's closer to Gaiman, if anything, but he was never as popular as Neil Gaiman is. I don't know, why am I framing it this way? Well, I guess too. But also, look at that minimalist ass cover. That's what I am talking about. This comic book. Was that unclear? The phrase "that's what I'm talking about" sounds insipid to my ears, is what I'm trying to say. After that, we have Norse Mythology #1. This is a bit of a departure for me, because this is the first time in a very long time that I'll be reading this funny book adaptation of this book entitled Norse Mythology, written by Neil Gaiman. My little sister, in fact, bought it for me for my birthday this year, but I have not had a chance to read it. I certainly will not get a chance to read that book before... I mean, I guess I don't have to report back to you on this next week, because who gives a shit, but I'm going to read it. It's also, because I used to be really embarrassed to admit that what I know of Norse mythology mostly comes from Marvel Comics. And I used to be embarrassed about that because I used to date a lady who used to make fun of me because all the classical music knowledge that I had was all from Warner Brothers cartoons. I almost married that one. So I've always wanted to, I've always wanted to read up more on Norse mythology. I think I even checked a book out from the library. Yeah, but that was a very long time ago. I want to say like 07, 08. But I read it, and I did not retain a ton of it. Most of my Norse mythology knowledge comes from, Thor comics. So, yeah, I've just been waiting for someone like Gaiman to write, because I think when I read that Norse mythology book, it was, one of those hokey old books from the 60s that's really boring. But this is Neil Gaiman, by God. And it's also drawn by P. Craig Russell. I'll admit, I don't normally do that, but I took a flip through here, and it looks like it's not being told like a narrative arc, which is kind of how I figured Gaiman would go about it in the book. Maybe the book does go chronologically, but this seems like it jumps around a little bit more, maybe. And again, maybe I'm wrong. P. Craig Russell is a very, very talented artist indeed. When I was in high school, the main thing I knew him from was the one issue of Sandman he drew, but it was a doozy. It was number 50, so it was an oversized issue. And I know he drew other things. The most recent thing he's done was, again, another Neil Gaiman adaptation, but he was writing that, and Scott Hampton was drawing it. That was American Gods. And so this is Russell back drawn again. And I'd forgotten how much I enjoy his work. He's very Art Nouveau, kind of like Charles Vess is very similar. I think he's English. I mean, if he's not English, his first initial is in his name. So, I mean, that's the same difference, right? So this looks like it'll be really good. Which is good, because I'm tired of things that are not good. And then finally, this is not out this week, but I just got it this week. This is Hellblazer, Rise and Fall #1 on the Hey Mabel, Get Another Black Label imprint on DC Comics. This is written by Tom Taylor and drawn by Derek Robertson, which is those are the two main draws. John Constantine, the Hellblazer, has never been one of my favoritist characters. He was originally created by Alan Moore for the Swamp Thing series that Alan Moore was writing, and I think it was Alan Moore was the writer, and then so co-creators would have been either John Totleben or Rick Veitch or both. And of course, they're not seeing any money. They didn't see any of the action off of that Keanu Reeves movie. You know who else didn't? The audience. So, yeah, but I do like, and apparently, no, I don't want to. What was I going to say? Oh, right. So I always liked I liked the character John Constantine enough to read several of the Hellblazer trades, and then when Peter Milligan, the aforementioned Peter Milligan, wrote Hellblazer, I think he might have come back to it, because that was the other thing about Hellblazer. It was not a favorite book of mine, but all of my favorite writers wrote it eventually. Garth Ennis wrote it for a long time, Brian Azzarello wrote it for a long time, and Peter Milligan wrote it for the last couple years that Vertigo was a thing and Hellblazer was being published by Vertigo. Vertigo used to exist outside of regular DC continuity, even though it was technically in it, I think. They do their continuity different than Marvel. Well, Marvel actually has the Max imprint, even though they haven't published anything in a long time. That might just be shuttered. But that was also, at least the Punisher stories in the Max line were considered outside of 616 canon. And now, John Constantine is in the DC universe. Again, like when Swamp Thing came out, even though Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, when you buy the trades now, they're labeled Vertigo. But at the time, in the 80s, they weren't. There wasn't such a thing as Vertigo until like 92 or 3. And then they put Swamp Thing, and they put Sandman, and they put a couple other books that were pre-Vertigo. They rebranded them Vertigo, which made sense, like books like Screamer, again by Peter Milligan. Not Vertigo originally, but Vertigo now. And actually, shit. I mean, they probably... Oh, that's right. So I was trying to think of this the other day because Vertigo's done, and I don't think DC is... If they're reprinting Sandman and stuff like that, which I feel like they must keep Sandman in print because it's just too good a seller even to this day. I would imagine, especially when Gaiman is so good at keeping his name out there, at least in literary circles. The guy's a manic workhorse. I don't know if I've ever discussed that, but Grant Morrison talks about him quite extensively in his own book, Super Gods, which is part memoir, part Grant Morrison's crazy drug trips, and part comic book history. So he talks a lot about how when he was coming up and, you know, Gaiman was kind of like in his class, and they're all English, or, well, Morrison is Scottish. He will not appreciate being called English. Morrison said that after, like, at conventions and stuff like that, after the show during the day, you know, he would go out and party, and most creators would. But he said Gaiman was one of those guys who would always just go back to his hotel room and keep writing. Like, he was really committed to his art and, you know, his job, because he really wanted to be a professional writer, and he became such. He's definitely very, I don't know, very niche, but he's at least somewhat niche, because he's kind of, he has that appeal to the kind of your gothier types, but I really enjoy his work. I was talking about Hellblazer, wasn't I? Why the hell did I get all... Man, whatever. Oh, right, that's where I was going. So now... So that's the other thing, is that DC recently did a couple years ago, was they took all of... Because Neil Gaiman came back and did a Sandman series a few years ago, and it sold really well. I bought it, because it was a new Sandman story, the first of its kind in, you know, over 20 years. And I think DC was like, oh, well, maybe we should do... So they took all of the Sandman characters, like the Dead Boy detectives and Lucifer and a bunch of others, and they put those under a brand, I think just called The Dreaming. Maybe that's the title of a book. The Dreaming is the realm in which Sandman lives. God damn. See, it's hard to keep track, especially when you don't care that much because it's DC. I can only imagine how those of you watching must be following that. So, all right. Picks of the week. Oh, I forgot to talk about Derek Ross. Tom Taylor wrote this issue of Hellblazer, this series, which I imagine is probably 4 issues or so. And Tom Taylor, he broke on a very odd book. There was a video game a few years back, I want to say 2014, around in there somewhere, called Injustice, and it was a DC superhero video game. And I think it was some goofy ass thing where it took place on a different Earth, and the Justice League are all evil or something. I don't remember. I don't give a shit. Because it was a video game, and I quit those a long time ago. I still love video games, I just don't play them anymore. The comic book of that, though, really took off. And this is when I was working at a comic book store back in San Diego, and my boss was my friend Frank, and he was like, this is actually really good. And generally, he and I have the same taste, or usually when he recommends something, I know that it's, probably worth it. But this was one of those rare cases where I was like, I don't need another goddamn DC book. So I passed. But Tom Taylor then did write Superior Iron Man for Marvel, which was an incredible series, which really got the shaft. They ended it early because of the Secret Wars crossover that was that year, but they never finished it. It really bothered me. It was a really interesting, because Marvel had just done a crossover called Axis, where a bunch of characters had their alignments switched around by some cosmic cube type thing. So characters like Sabretooth and Carnage and Magneto all became good, and characters like Iron Man and Scarlet Witch and who else became bad. I don't know, somebody else. And they had already been doing the Superior Spider-Man storyline, wherein Dr. Octopus, but right before he died, managed to switch his consciousness with that of Peter Parker's, so he was alive in Peter Parker's body. Dr. Octopus, as soon as he did that, realized, oh, Spider-Man is Peter Parker. Like, he was trying to take over Spider-Man's body. He goes, oh, Spider-Man is Peter Parker. He has all of his memories, so he goes, oh no, I've been fighting this guy who's actually a good person, and I'm a piece of shit. So Dr. Octopus then, in his newfound body, became the Superior Spider-Man, because even though he had a change of alignment, a change of heart, he was still an asshole. So he still thought he could do a better job than Peter Parker had done. And so he was very impersonal and very snide and shit. And he acted very superior, hence the title. So Superior Iron Man was a very similar thing that Tom Taylor wrote, where Tony, he got juiced by this cosmic cube, moved to San Francisco, which I don't think he had ever done before. Like, the X-Men were located in San Francisco for a while. Daredevil moved to San Francisco for a while, but it had been... In fact, the X-Men were in San Francisco not even that long ago, I want to say. Anyway. He moved to San Francisco, and he set up an app. It's so crazy. He set up an app that became addictive. I don't remember how exactly. It was like an app that made you feel it was like a drug. And he released it into the market in San Francisco. It immediately became the biggest selling app, and then immediately people were junkies, and he was like destroying the economy, and it was so good. And he didn't give a shit. He was back to being an old asshole Tony. I don't remember if he had fallen off the wagon in that story. There's a little sidebar. I mean, one of the things about Tony Stark, his character, is that he is an alcoholic, and it seems obvious, but I think they've only done a story where he's fallen off the wagon once, and that was during Fear itself. And it was actually really good, because Matt Fraction wrote it, and whatever you want to say about him, he apparently had a lot of first-hand experience with recovery, so it really came out in that book. I don't care for his work now, and he also seems like kind of an asshole. I'm in a very anti-asshole mood right now. Sorry for swearing for them. Picks of the week. Now picks of last week. All right. So last week, it's pretty good. I'm finally all caught up on my single issues. That's the first time that I've been able to say that in some time. I mean, I've always been able to say it. So, starting with X-Ray Robot number 2. This was a lot of fun, and the allreds took mercy on people like me. And I think I mentioned this last week. The first issue of this came out the last week that there were new comic books being distributed before quarantine. And so, that was 6-7 months ago. So when this came out, I was like, I have no idea what's going on anymore. And most of this issue is kind of filling you in on that, but in such a way that it's not. It's like the characters do. There's several pages of exposition, but there's also several pages of action happening while that's going on, and also Mike Allred's art is just goddamn good. I never get tired of it. I can look at it all day. He's one of those few artists where I will really take my time. Derek Robertson, actually, I meant to finish talking about this. Tom Taylor wrote this. Derek Robertson drew The Boys originally. He was the co-creator of The Boys with Garth Ennis, but I don't know that he even drew the bulk of the series. I don't remember why. I think Robertson was just really slow in general, so, and I don't think he was doing anything else, but he probably already didn't want to. So they'd get Russ Braun to fill in, or Peter Snedberg, who I never liked. I mean, what if he's a nice guy? Go home and play with your kids. I also got Shang Chi #1. This is also really fun, as I had imagined. It also, I won't get into specifics, mostly because I don't remember them, but it did seem like Gene Luen Yang is really trying to square the mythology of the Master of Kung Fu from its original time. Because I think I mentioned this last week. Shang-Chi is the son of Fu Manchu, and he had been under the impression that he was living in feudal China, and Fu Manchu was its benevolent ruler. But then he found out Fu Manchu is not benevolent at all. You'd think he would tell because his name was Fu Manchu, but no. And then he finds out that the feudal China he thought he'd grown up in, I think it was feudal. I think it was in the past. I mean, everything's feudal. But he wasn't. He was actually in modern day New York, and Fu Manchu had somehow built an entire replica of China, feudal China, under New York City. Completely insipid. That would never in a million years happen. And it was fine in the 70s. Who give a shit? But now it feels like, not with that specific thing, but there's a lot of sort of, and you see this a lot nowadays, and I think it's great. There's a lot of kind of smoothing over of past stupidness. Not necessarily because it was racist. I mean, in some cases it is, but in this case, it's just kind of dumb. I'm stoked on this book, and I'm bummed it's only a 4-issue series. But what are you going to do? Oh, and then this was kind of a surprise. This is Giant Size X-Men #1, a tribute to Len Wein and Dave Cockrum. So, back in 1975, I think I said 78 last year. 1975, the X-Men, the Uncanny X-Men was in reprints. They weren't doing new stories. And they were going to shut it down, and I think it was Wein. They talked to both Len Wein and Dave Cockrum's widows, and they tell the story. But I think it was basically kind of similar to how when Stan Lee created Spider-Man, or co-created it. They were going to shut the book down, so Wein was like, well, let me just take a crack at something. Let me try doing it a different way. So instead of it being these 5 white kids at a private school, it became 8 mutants of varying ages and from different backgrounds. So you had Wolverine was Canadian, and Colossus was Russian, and Nightcrawler was German, and so on and so on. Storm is African. And it hit big. But Len Wein was already writing like 5 other books, so he wrote this issue and then gave it to Claremont, and that became, Chris Claremont was only 22, or maybe even just 21. But because Claremont writes a thing in here about watching these guys. He watched Wein and Cockrum essentially create this team of X-Men. Wein had already created Wolverine for Incredible Hulk 181. But I think this is the first appearance of Storm and Nightcrawler and the rest of them. Oh, and poor Thunderbird, who got killed almost immediately. So Giant Size X-Men #1 has become very much a watershed moment in the Marvel universe, specifically to X-Men. Another 20 minutes, Jesus Christ. So what they did for this tribute is they took the original script and original art and gave a page to a bunch of different artists. So it's a recreation of Giant Size X-Men #1 just by different artists. And some of them are like Guru Hiru and other less goofy names that are harder to remember. But it was really good, and and it's always fun to read this X-Men stuff again. I still love it as much as I did when I was a kid. In fact, not to make it even longer, but I've been rereading the Inferno storyline, which was from Marvel Comics in the 80s. It was the first major Marvel crossover that I'd ever read. And rereading it again now, it's definitely not as good. There's a lot of places where I was like, ugh. But, you know, in that way that superhero comics in the late 80s were. But I read Uncanny X-Men number 242 the other day, which was one of the first comic books I ever bought. Definitely one of the first X-Men comics I ever bought. And it still holds up. It's like, for a single issue, it's incredible. If you ever get a chance to read Inferno or just that issue of X-Men, I would highly recommend it. And it wasn't just because I was 11 when it came out. Like, I was looking at it, I was like, man, Mark Silvestri never had a better issue. And he was a very good artist, but he never had a better issue of X-Men. Maybe 223. Okay. All right, that's the end of this. It's 20 goddamn minutes. Okay, bye.